So I was going to piss some people off by saying 99% of the time, it's best to EQ after compression. And I still believe that, but it's not for the same reason I decided to make this video, because the test that was going to make me look so great and right and everything in theory was correct actually showed how ignorant I was. So the theory that I've always run with is to EQ after compression, because if you EQ into the compressor, you minimize the amount of EQ that's being applied. Because it makes sense in theory. If you have a signal and then you bump an EQ up 3 decibels, you compress after, that dynamic range minimizes, so that EQ change minimizes, and it's something I preached before. But I wanted to do a test to prove it to you, because I go, well, this makes perfect sense. It is exactly as it should work. So I've got a tone generator here. Let's just open this up. We've got 440 hertz and 2 octaves above, 1760 hertz. And that's going into a bus here. Okay, so if we have a look at this, we'll solo here. You can see one is at -20, one's at -38 decibels. So I thought if we add a compressor, what's going to happen is that distance is going to actually change. Let's see. Add a compressor, it's compressing a little bit. The distance does not change between those two notes. And the reason is it looks at the overall peak value, and it's a controlled amplifier. A compressor is a controlled amplification circuit, automatic controlled amplification, which brings the overall signal down in volume. Okay, cool. So what happens if we EQ into this? What happens? Well, let's EQ 18 decibels into it, so both the signals are the same level. What happens if we turn this compressor off? It's exactly the same relationship. What you're seeing there in the harmonics is a bit of intermodulation distortion, but that's natural with all forms of compression when you're compressing this hard. But the relative volume is exactly the same. So I thought it was going to minimize that EQ move. Well, what happens if we compress and then EQ afterwards? The same. And what happens if we have an EQ going into a compressor and a compressor going into an EQ, and a level match it as closely as we can and flip the phase? It cancels out there because the EQ is in the same spot, but let's put the EQ after. You've got about -60 decibels of difference. So you're not actually minimizing that EQ move by doing it before or after, because what's happening is it's reading the peak level and then it's taking the overall signal and bringing it down. It's not bringing down that little bit of EQ above. Now, there's a case to say here, and we're going to go into an actual track and start doing some EQ and compression. There's a case to say here, but if you're EQing a certain frequency that's on a transient and it pokes up, then you compress and it pulls it back down. That's true, but the original theory to say that you're ruining your masters by EQing beforehand because it minimizes the EQ change doesn't apply. That's what I was going to run this whole video on, to say you're fucking your masters up if this is what you're doing. It doesn't apply. First, let's listen to this track before I go into explaining it. This is a mix I did for Jazz. It's called Take Me Away. Just vibe to this for a sec. Okay, so the balance of this is pretty much super tight, and there's this theory of EQing before the compressor so the low end doesn't control it too much, or a bit of sibilance doesn't control it too much, or whatever it might be. But my issue with this is when you're actually EQing into the compressor to make those changes, are those changes for the sake of the compressor or for the sake of the tone in the EQ? We need the compressor to work the way we want it to work, and that's why I don't like to EQ in a compression. I rather use sidechain, because my thinking is the mix is the mix. As a mastering engineer, I hear the mix and I go, this is the way the mix is meant to sound. This is the representation. If I need to control the dynamics, I don't want to change the representation of the mix for the sake of dynamics. I got Pro C2 here to demonstrate this as visually as I can. We don't want the kick to drive the compression, the low end of that kick. Let's actually work a high pass filter sidechain in here.
If I didn't see it, took a sip of coffee, you left me wanting more. Working 9 to 5 and I just can't escape this feeling. It's getting too hard out here. I need a break.
But then some people like to use EQ to actually drive their compressors. So what happens if you wanted to drive the upper mid so the snare made the compressor crunch a little bit? Well, we can do that as well. So we can actually boost these upper mids with a bell here and change the way the compression actually reacts to those upper mids without changing the tone of that signal, just the sidechain.
Some things it's clear. Oh, I'm drowning in this atmosphere.
So you're getting what I'm saying here. I'm saying, well, rather than EQing for the sake of the compressor, why not EQ the sidechain signal for the sake of the compressor? That is a more effective solution. As a mastering engineer, I'm more willing to explore. Now, Luca Predalesi does something really cool with EDM tracks. If I had an EDM example, I probably should have used that. But what he'll do is he'll use the mid-range to drive the compression. So the low-end transients, the top-end transients don't control the compression. They're free to sort of move at will, but the mid-range, where the focus of the leads, the vocal, the energy, all the harmonics, is what drives the compression, is what changes that energy level in the dynamics. So I've got a high pass and a low pass filter here, pretty aggressive, and take a listen to how this shapes the compressor.
Me back to sleep, I can't believe I didn't see it. Took a sip of coffee, you left me wanting more. Working 9 to 5 and I just can't escape this feeling.
Now, if you're concerned about sibilance, a little trick here to do is with this EQ, you can really get some narrow bands and then just get that sibilant frequency and EQ it out so it's not controlling your compressor. So that way you can DS after your compressor and control it with more, like being able to get into more detail post-compression. But this is a really good tool. Pro C2, the ability to just EQ away your sidechain signal. So instead of EQing into your compressor, use the sidechain. People just think sidechain is, you use a high pass filter on your compressor and that's all the sidechain you have. No, you have other features. Pro C2 is probably the most accessible one and simple to use, where you just have a parametric 3-band EQ here, where you can just shape the sound as it feeds the compressor, which is a huge benefit to mastering. Now, in terms of post the fact of compression, EQ now is free to be tone. It's not there to control or reshape the signal for the sake of the compressor. You can do that in the sidechain signal and leave the mixer's integrity in check while just controlling the dynamics. And then after the fact, you have all the freedom to EQ. Another reason that is very practical in the sense of a mastering studio and having recalls and clients coming in and wanting changes to a mix is by EQing after the compressor. Any change I make here, the compressor will not be affected. Whereas if my client says, I want a little bit more low end, I want a little bit more top end, etc., and my EQ falls directly before the compressor, every change I make on the EQ is going to change the way the compressor reacts. Which means every time I do a recall, if I change the EQ, I'm going to have to look at the compressor, see how it's working, because they might love the dynamics. And if I go tweaking an EQ that comes before a compressor, they're not going to like the dynamics afterwards, or it's going to be changed and they might not like it as much. So this is really important practice. Ultimately, you don't want to fuck up your masters. EQ after your compressor. If you need to change the tone or drive your compressor in a certain way, use a sidechain signal. I always get that wrong. Anyway, this is a small tip, and funnily enough, I was very wrong at the start of exploring this. The premise of it's still the same, but I thought it was much worse than what it was, and I'm happy to admit fault and be a bit of a, not a loser, but just ignorant at it, because I did set up this test to see, hey, if you compress two signals at different levels and you EQ before, you EQ after, are you minimizing that EQ change? You're not, okay? By way of this test, if you can think of a way to run a more empirical test more effectively, I want to know, and I want to do that with whatever you send my way. But until then, this is how I've made sense of all this. I hope this helps you. And let me summarize this quickly. EQ after compression. If you need an EQ for the sake of the compressor, use a sidechain signal. Simple. Until next time, take care.